My name's Ethan, and my wife Sarah and I thought we'd found our dream when we bought that old farmhouse. We were both city kids, her a kindergarten teacher, me in graphic design, and the idea of getting away from the noise, planting a garden, maybe raising chickens, felt like the kind of fresh start people write about and put on vision boards. The listing called it quaint and secluded. The realtor called it charming. What they didn't really sell you on was how alone it would feel once the sun went down. The property sat back from a county road, surrounded on three sides by cornfields that went on for acres. Evenings were beautiful, the golden tassels at dusk, the farmhouse silhouetted against a wide, empty sky, but that same isolation started to shift from peaceful to unnerving. At first, it was small things. A different rustle in the corn at 2 or 3 a.m., the sound moving like a wave. Sarah blamed raccoons, I blamed my imagination. After a month, the rustling felt more deliberate, like something walking between the rows. The first time I actually saw a figure, I thought I was half asleep. It was late July, and the porch light poured a cone of yellow across the yard. From the kitchen window, I saw a silhouette standing at the edge of the corn, shoulders hunched, head tipped as if listening. He didn't move, just watched. For a second, I thought it was a scarecrow. When I rubbed my eyes and looked again, he was gone. The next night, I caught the shape again, this time deeper in the rows. I woke Sarah. We watched from the bedroom window as the dark column vanished between stalks like the field swallowed him whole. We told ourselves it was a late farmer or a neighbor, but the sighting repeated over days, and whatever it was seemed to enjoy not being seen. We tried the logical fixes a rural couple would think of first. Motion-activated lights around the perimeter, porch lamps on timers. The lights flashed like pinpricks when triggered, chasing one another down the rows and scaring off the wildlife at first. But then the lights began to be triggered in ways that made the hair on my neck stand up. A light would go off, we'd wait, and minutes later, another, further down the row, would wink on. Not a scattering of animals, but targeted activations, like something pacing and watching us look its way. One evening in early September, we had friends over. For the first time, it felt like the house was a home again. The sun dropped, laughter rose, and someone joked about the man in the corn. After dark, the air tightened. Then, very faint and slow, we heard steps. At first, I thought someone was on the porch. The cadence was wrong. Soft, flat, more the sound of feet in soil than wood. The footsteps circled our house. They moved deliberately along the base of the corn, going end to end. Our neighbor's hound and our rescue pup lifted their heads and didn't bark. They only stared where the rows met blackness. The laughter died. Phones came out. Lighters sparked. And still the footsteps kept pacing, a ring closing slowly around the property. We called the sheriff. The dispatcher said someone would check it out, but warned it was a busy county Friday night. We sat on the porch like sentries, flashlights cooling in our hands. The circling kept going, methodical and patient. Nearly an hour later, a cruiser finally pulled in and the footsteps stopped. The officer walked the perimeter with a flashlight, his beam slicing the corn into faces of stalks that disappeared at the edge of the light. He took our statement, then frowned in a way that stole the rest of our bravado. No tracks, no sign someone got that close. It's like they walked on air. He left a card and some tips about keeping lights on and calling again if it escalated. We thanked him, but when the cruiser drove off, the farmhouse felt smaller, as if the silence pressed in. The officer had checked the obvious and left the rest to us and to whatever was circling. After that night, everything felt amplified. I barely slept. Sarah started waking in the early hours to watch the field from the kitchen window. Small things changed during the day. A tomato plant bent as if brushed by a sleeve. A mailbox wrapper twisted as if someone walked the edge of the yard and only touched the plants. Once, after a weekend away, we returned to find a narrow path in the corn. The stalks flattened in a deliberate line that led to the house and then veered away like a question mark. No footprints, just crushed green and the damp smell of soil. We tried to gather evidence. We borrowed a thermal camera, set up lights with motion logs, checked fences and locks. The camera captured deer, a raccoon, the usual. But the night the footsteps circled, playback showed only background noise for a stretch of 2 hours. No heat signatures approaching the house, even though we had heard the steps clearly. Tools that should have told us the truth gave us nothing. That, more than anything, unmoored me. If we'd misheard, the footage would show it. If kids had been daring each other, the heat would be obvious. Instead, the evidence refused to line up with our ears. We asked around town. Some locals offered half smiles and shook their heads. Mrs. Denvey at the feed store lowered her voice and hinted at older stories, hobos back in the 50s, a silhouette on Cornersworth Road. But then she tapped the counter twice and stopped talking. Her reaction felt like a warning. In other places I'd hear speculation, prank kids, a drifter, someone lost. But none of those explanations fit the way the thing moved, slowly, patiently, almost as if it was cataloging our habits. For the next 2 weeks, we lived on frayed nerves. Our friends stopped coming over at night. We ate on the porch less. Phone messages piled up unanswered. Sarah began to fold herself inward, asking me to come straight home and calling from the grocery store if she didn't hear my key in the lock. I found myself checking the perimeter twice at night, listening for the soft scrape I once heard like fingertips along the clapboard as something paced the house from front to back. Finally, we made the call that split whatever hope remained. We moved out 2 weeks later. There wasn't one single event that made us leave. It was accumulation, the pacing, the invisible patrol, the flattened row after we'd been away, the officer's words that kept replaying in my head. We packed with a speed I didn't know we had, the boxes blurting out our life like sudden weather. Before we left, Sarah pinned a small bouquet of wildflowers to the porch and tacked a note to the door that simply asked for peace. It felt absurd and necessary at once. On our last night, we sat on the porch with the lamps off and watched the corn like two people waiting for a storm to pass. Nothing came. No footsteps circled. Not even a fox disturbed the hush. We left at dawn with the sky cut into the fields, and for a little while I let myself imagine we'd made the right choice. A month later, a neighbor called with news. The corn had been harvested early, the combine coming through at night. Strange timing, he said. When we drove by the empty field on an errand, the stalks lay flat like bodies sleeping. Far off on the field's edge, we saw a dark silhouette standing where the rows ended. It lifted its head once like someone taking note of a house that had been empty for a short while. Maybe it was kids. Maybe it was a lonely man who liked walking the fields at night. Maybe it was exhaustion and the way isolation bends the mind. I don't know. But evidence, our ears, the thermal footage, the flattened path, didn't match easy answers. Whatever it was, walked without leaving traces. It watched without stepping into the light. We sold the farmhouse months later at a loss and moved closer to town where noise is familiar and neighbors show up at your door. Sometimes I imagine the silhouette still standing at the edge of the corn, patient, like someone keeping a long promise. That patience is what unnerves me most. If you ever find yourself out where the country swallows the horizon and you hear slow footsteps tracing the edge of your property in the dark, listen to that warning. Some things in the rows are better left observed from a distance.
The summer I turned 17, my brother Caleb and I spent 2 weeks at our uncle's farm in Iowa. At the time, I thought it would be a boring trip. The town was small, the nights too quiet, and the cornfields stretched endlessly in every direction like a green ocean swallowing the horizon. But what happened in those fields, what we heard and saw out there, has haunted me every night since. Our uncle lived alone, a quiet man who worked sun up to sundown. He was kind, but he kept to himself, and he rarely joined us in conversation, except during meals. The first few days, Caleb and I helped him with chores, feeding the animals, hauling hay, fixing fences. It was hard work, but we didn't complain. We were used to city life, and the farm felt foreign, almost timeless. No streetlights, no neighbors, just rows and rows of corn whispering in the wind. On the fourth morning, while walking the property with Caleb, I noticed something strange. In the eastern cornfield, near the old fence line, stood a scarecrow. At first, it didn't register as odd. Scarecrows belonged in cornfields, after all. But I realized quickly that it hadn't been there before. I'd walked that path every day since we'd arrived, and I was certain the post had been bare. The scarecrow was crudely made, a crooked wooden frame dressed in a faded plaid shirt and torn overalls. Its head was a burlap sack with 2 black buttons sewn for eyes and a mouth stitched into a crooked, permanent smile. Its arms hung awkwardly, stuffed with straw that poked out at the seams. Something about it unsettled me immediately. It looked too deliberate, as if someone had taken great care to make it look wrong. "Was that here yesterday?" I asked Caleb. He shook his head. "Nope. Uncle didn't put that up. He hasn't mentioned anything about a scarecrow." We shrugged it off, though uneasily, and continued with our chores. But as we walked away, I swear I felt its button eyes following us. That night, lying awake in the small bedroom we shared, I heard it for the first time. A faint sound carried in from the open window, the soft rustling of the corn. At first I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it. A whisper. My name. Eli. It was so faint, I thought I'd imagined it. But then, a moment later, I heard it again. Louder, clearer. Eli. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. Caleb stirred beside me, muttering in his sleep. I considered waking him, but something froze me in place. The whisper came again, stretched out like a hiss, and I knew, without seeing, that it was coming from the cornfield. The next morning, I told Caleb. He laughed at first, saying I'd probably dreamed it, but when we walked past the scarecrow, he fell silent. Its head was tilted slightly to the left. I could have sworn yesterday it had been straight. That night, we both stayed awake. The farmhouse creaked with the settling of old wood, and the crickets sang endlessly outside. Around midnight, the whisper returned. Caleb. This time it called his name. He sat bolt upright, eyes wide. "You heard that?" I whispered. He nodded slowly. His face was pale. The voice called again from the cornfield, dragging out his name in a way that made the hairs on my arms rise. We both ran to the window, staring out into the night. The scarecrow was still there, faintly visible in the moonlight. Its head now turned slightly more, facing the house. The whispers stopped. For the next few days, we avoided the eastern field. We made excuses not to go near it, even if chores took us close. Our uncle noticed our strange behavior, but didn't pry. He was a man of few words, and perhaps he thought city kids just weren't cut out for farm life. But Caleb and I knew better. Something was wrong out there. The whispers grew bolder. Sometimes they came in the early evening before the sun had fully set. Sometimes they carried into the house as though the voice was moving closer. Always soft, always just on the edge of hearing, but always calling our names. One night, unable to take it anymore, Caleb insisted we go to the field and confront it. "We'll prove it's nothing," he said, though his voice wavered. So, armed only with a flashlight, we crept through the yard and into the corn. The stalks loomed high above us, their leaves brushing against our arms like grasping fingers. The ground crunched under our boots, every step loud in the suffocating silence. As we neared the scarecrow, the air grew colder. The flashlight beam trembled in Caleb's hand. "See?" he whispered. "It's just..." The scarecrow's head moved. It was subtle, but we both saw it. Slowly, deliberately, it turned toward us. The stitched smile seemed to widen in the light, the button eyes glinting unnaturally. And then we heard it. Not whispered this time, but clear, close, and everywhere at once. "Eli! Caleb!" We dropped the flashlight and ran. We didn't stop until we were back in the farmhouse, gasping for breath, our uncle shouting at us for making such a racket. We didn't tell him what we'd seen. Somehow I knew he wouldn't believe us. Or worse, that he would. The rest of our stay passed in a blur of dread. We avoided the eastern field entirely, but the whispers never stopped. They followed us every night until the day we left. When we returned home, I tried to put it behind me. I told myself it was a trick of the wind, an overactive imagination. But deep down, I know what we saw. Last week, Caleb called me late at night. His voice was shaking. He said he'd been out for a walk in his neighborhood when he passed a small community garden. And there, standing among the rows of tomatoes and cucumbers, was a scarecrow. Its head was tilted slightly to the left, and when he turned away, he swears he heard it whisper his name. Caleb told me he's never set foot in those cornfields again, and honestly, I don't blame him. Whether it was some twisted prank, a spirit bound to the land, or something much older wearing the skin of a scarecrow, he doesn't care to find out. The farm eventually sold after his uncle passed, but Caleb swears that if you drive past on certain nights, you can still see it standing out there, the same crooked scarecrow, watching.
I grew up on a farm in rural Pennsylvania, where the days were filled with chores, long stretches of quiet, and the sound of wind moving through endless fields. The farmhouse itself had been in our family for generations, built in the late 1800s. Its walls held history, though as a child, I didn't think much of it. I thought of the house as safe, cozy, and a little creaky, the kind of place where every sound had an explanation. But when I was 14, that sense of comfort began to unravel. It started with small, almost laughable things. A teacup I'd left on the kitchen counter ended up in the sink. Books fell from the shelves without anyone touching them. My parents dismissed it all as clumsiness, gravity, or drafts that snuck through the old windows. I tried to agree. After all, what else could it be? Still, something inside me felt unsettled. One night, I was in my room upstairs, reading with my bedside lamp. The farmhouse was quiet. My parents had gone to bed, and the only sound was the hum of crickets outside. I felt drowsy and turned off the lamp. That's when I saw her. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks. In the corner of the room, where the moonlight barely touched, stood the faint outline of a woman. She wasn't moving, just standing, silent, watching. She wore what looked like a long dress that pooled at her feet, and her hair was tucked into a bun beneath what I can only describe as a thin lace cap, the kind you'd imagine an older woman from the past century wearing. But the detail that froze me was her face. She had none, or rather, it was obscured in a way that made it impossible to distinguish. A blur, a hollow where expression should have been. I screamed. My parents came running, flipping on the lights. The corner was empty. They calmed me down, insisting it was a dream, a shadow, an overactive imagination. Maybe I wanted to believe them, but I knew what I saw. After that, she came back. Not every night, but often enough to keep me sleeping with the light on. I would wake up in the middle of the night to find her standing there. Closer sometimes, other times by the window. She never spoke, never moved, just watched. As the weeks passed, strange occurrences spread through the house. My mother found her sewing kit moved from one room to another, though no one had touched it. My father swore he heard footsteps pacing the upstairs hallway when the rest of us were downstairs. The dog, who normally slept at the foot of my bed, began refusing to come into my room at all. He would growl low in his throat, staring at the empty corner before retreating. One evening, I finally asked my grandmother about the farmhouse. She had grown up there before passing it to my parents. At first, she brushed me off, but when I pressed, she sighed, lowered her voice, and told me something that has stayed with me ever since. When she was a girl, she too had seen an old woman in the farmhouse. She described her the same way I had, the lace cap, the long dress, the silent watching. She never hurt anyone, my grandmother said, but she never left either. According to family lore, the original owner of the farmhouse had been a widow who lived there alone after her husband died in a farming accident. She was said to be stern, private, and deeply attached to the property. Locals whispered she refused to leave even after death, clinging to the house as though it was all she had. That night I felt both relief and dread. Relief that I wasn't crazy, dread that what I was seeing wasn't new and might never stop. The final time I saw her was the clearest. It was winter, the fields outside covered in frost. I woke suddenly, sensing I wasn't alone. There she was again, not in the corner this time, but standing beside my bed. Close enough that I could see the faint outline of her hands clasped in front of her. Her face was still blurred, but I swear I could feel her gaze, heavy and sorrowful, pressing into me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Every muscle in my body screamed to run, but I was pinned in place. And then, as silently as she appeared, she turned toward the window, stepped forward, and faded into the night air. After that night, the sightings stopped. The object still shifted occasionally, footsteps still echoed in empty rooms, but she never showed herself to me again. Years later, after I'd moved away, my younger cousin moved into that same room while staying with my parents. He never knew my story. And yet one summer evening, he came down pale and trembling, swearing he saw a woman in an old-fashioned dress standing by the window. My parents looked at me then, their faces unreadable. They never denied it again. I don't think the old woman ever meant to harm us. In fact, I believe she was tied to the farmhouse not by malice, but by devotion. It had been her home, her life's anchor, and even death couldn't pull her away. Some people might call it a haunting. I prefer to think of it as a reminder that the past lingers, woven into the walls and floors of the places we live. I don't stay in that room anymore, and I don't plan to. But every time I visit the farmhouse, I half expect to catch a glimpse of her again in the corner of my eye, still standing watch. Because some houses don't just belong to us. Sometimes we belong to them.